This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
The author of Mockingbird Songs, My Friendship with Harper Lee, Wayne Flynt, on this edition of Conversations. Harper Lee is one of the most intriguing figures in American literature. The author of the classic To Kill a Mockingbird was a mystery to most, but to Wayne Flynt, she was more than an iconic writer. She was a dear friend. Flynt, a historian, author, and Professor Emeritus in the Department of History at Auburn University, shares the joys of their friendship in his book entitled Mockingbird Songs, My Friendship with Harper Lee. We welcome Dr. Wayne Flynt to Conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff.
Tell me about your first encounter with Harper Lee.
There are two ways to answer that question, Jeff. One is not a physical encounter, but it's probably the most important encounter of all our conversations. I was a graduate student at Florida State University in 1963. We attended First Baptist Church in Tallahassee because I'd been a ministerial student in a different incarnation of my life. And the reason I'd left the ministry to go to grad school was because of my different attitudes on race. And Southern Baptist churches would not have called me as pastor given my attitudes. So I went there as a different kind of Alabamian. But in 1963, we left a church after services in September, on September 13th, went to our house, turned on television, and heard about the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church and the murder of 4 little girls in Sunday school. And I remember telling my wife, I don't know where we'll go back to teach when we're done here, but I will never go back to Alabama. She was the daughter of an Alabama Baptist preacher, and so she was kind of shocked, but I said, I can't live there anymore. And about 3 months later, I read To Kill a Mockingbird because I'd been busy with my doctoral program at Florida State and had not had time to read any fiction. I read the book. And I thought if someone from the bottom of the Alabama Black Belt, arguably the most racist, lynch-oriented part of America, could write a book with such stunning empathy and understanding of our racial conflict, our original American sin, I may have missed something about Alabama. And to make a long story short, in 1965, I had an offer to go back to my alma mater, Samford University in Birmingham. Went back, spent 12 years there, and then spent 28 years in Auburn and never left Alabama. So that was my first meeting. And that was the key to the second and most important meeting, because in 1983, Auburn had a History and Heritage Festival in Eufaula, Alabama, where her sister, Louise, the middle sister, lived. Louise had gone to Auburn, was anxious to have the History and Humanities Festival come there. We're going to talk about religion, literature, history of the area. And we had a local planning committee on which Louise Connor, Nell's sister, served. And obviously our first thought of a keynote speaker was Harper Lee. But obviously also we knew that by reputation, she did not speak in public. We knew that she had not spoken since she spoke at West Point in the middle 1960s, anywhere. So for 20 plus years, she's not spoken anywhere. It's not likely she's going to speak at Eufaula for our History and Heritage Conference. So we just suggested offhand that maybe Louise could get Nell to help us get Truman Capote, her best friend. Well, we didn't know at that point that he was going to die within a year or two, that he was drug addicted, that he would appear in public lectures and fall off stages and things like that. And I'm convinced to this day that Louise was so embarrassed with the thought of Truman coming and humiliating everybody and making a fool of himself, that she asked Nell to come and speak because it would avoid the humiliation of us asking Truman Capote. And to her everlasting credit, and really quite revealing about her personality, she came and spoke. And Jeff, she was incredibly afraid of speaking in public.
Really?
She became nauseous. She could not sleep at night. And for weeks, she worried about public speaking. So here's someone who was one of the most lyrical writers of the 20th century and terrified of speaking in public. She came that night. She had a manuscript, and it was absolutely brilliant. And that's the only thing she did since that speech at West Point in the 1960s. And all of a sudden, I met her that night for the first time. And when I heard all the background story here about what happened, I thought, now here's a woman who's considered to be remote, not very courteous. And in fact, when I asked her to sign my book, she said, I don't sign books for adults, I only sign books for children. And I thought, well, that was not very kind. And so my first reaction was, I love Louise Connor, and we had started visiting her once a month and taking her to a favorite soul food restaurant in Lumpkin, Georgia. And I really liked her, but I didn't like her sister, the great eminent scholar, very much. So then she began to write me about her sister Louise's decline into dementia. She knew that something was wrong, and because we went to see her every month or so from Auburn, only 35 miles away, she began to write. And that began our written conversation. So I met her in '83. I wrote an op-ed column about the Lee family in '92, and she sent me a thank you letter, and I responded thanking her for the thank you letter. And then we don't correspond again until 10, 11 years later, when she writes me to ask me about her sister. And then from that point on, we became first acquaintances, then friends, then dear friends, then best friends. And it's because of the serendipity of life. Yeah. The fact that her sister was sick, otherwise we would have never had a friendship and there would have been no letters. And the fact that in April of 2007, she had a stroke in New York, came to Health South in Birmingham for 6 months of rehab. My mother was elderly and lived in Birmingham, so we were visiting my mother, we visited Nell, and that shifted the relationship to something very different because she is so incredibly private that the Health South Rehab Center there wouldn't let anybody know that she was there. And incredibly, for 6 months, the doctors, the nurses, the rehab people, the staff never revealed to anyone that she was there. And really quite an incredible story of medical respect for the privacy of a person like her. But we had gotten to know her really well while she was there. And then when she could not go back to New York to live, but went to Monroeville, then we started going down about every month or so to Monroeville. And over a period of 10 years, we visited her 64 times, and I have 200 pages of entries in my journal of material which someday may be a book called Afternoons with Nell, where her stories are as wonderful as her letters. Her letters are breathtaking, funny, sardonic, satirical, frank to the point of offending people. And her stories are exactly the same way. And so that is the trajectory of a friendship.
Tell me about what those afternoons were like. I saw a photograph, for example, of you, and I would assume it must have been a hospital room or perhaps an assisted living facility where you were actually reading to her.
That's right.
Here you are, you're reading to Harper Lee.
That's right.
What's this like?
Well, by that point in her life, she's in her 80s. She died just before she turned 90. She would have turned 90 in April of 2016, and she died on February 19th of February that year. And she had macular degeneration, which had become increasingly worse, so that she could see shapes, but that was about the extent. She couldn't recognize who you were. Mm-hmm. She just knew there was someone in the room or there was some motion. She also had profound deafness. And the irony of a person who is as brilliant intellectually, as cosmopolitan socially and culturally as she was, who had known and been with the most important writers and many of the most important politicians in American history, and yet she's profoundly in this cubicle, mm-hmm. shut off from people. And I discovered that if I talked to her 10 inches from her right ear, that she could hear me. She couldn't hear my wife at all because my wife's voice is too soft. But if I talked like this, 10 inches from her right ear. She would sometimes say, "What did you say?" But she would watch me until she figured out what I had said just by the shape of my mouth. And once she knew, we could carry on a perfectly logical, oftentimes very intellectual conversation. But you can already understand the preparation for the misunderstanding of Go Set a Watchman. Because if you did not know what was happening, when she's saying, "What? What did you say? Who? What do you mean?" This is a sign of dementia. Yeah. This is a sign of her sister's illness. Mm-hmm. And so it was easy to misunderstand what was happening. But I knew that if I waited long enough, if I tried hard enough, she would actually begin to be able to see me, see my lips well enough, and that she could actually begin to carry on a conversation. And once she knew the topic, we didn't have any problem at all. Wow. And obviously, like anyone whose voice is a voice you don't understand or they talk too soft, if you will just listen very carefully for a few minutes, after 5 or 10 or 15 minutes of not understanding anything they say, suddenly that speech pattern develops. And my wife was in speech pathology, so she helped me with this. But then I had to repeat everything my wife said to her.
Right. Interesting. You mentioned New York. I mean, she lived in New York and also in Monroeville, Alabama. I don't know how you could have two places that were more different. Talk about her relationship with New York City.
Well, first of all, I'd like to correct a mistake you made, Jeff.
Okay.
And it's a mistake that is almost universal.
Okay.
Everyone who writes a pretend biography of her, everyone who writes about her in the newspapers, everyone says she split her time between New York and Monroeville. No, she didn't.
Okay.
After 1949, when she left the University of Alabama without her law degree at age 23, she never lived in Monroeville again.
Okay.
She never had a house. She never had an apartment. Now, she would go, usually around Thanksgiving, back home to Monroeville. She would stay usually until New Year's Day or so. And no day was ever happier for her than when she got on Amtrak and went back to New York. And in fact, she says as much in Go Set a Watchman. In the early chapters of Go Set a Watchman, she talks about this love-hate relationship with Monroeville. The only exception to that is when her father was ill with cancer before he died, and she became his caregiver. And amazingly enough, this was a role which she played quite well. She had been caregiver to Maurice Crane, her agent, who had a place in Connecticut, as well as his agent's office with his wife, Annie Laurie Williams, in New York City. And since she had to keep the business going, when he developed cancer and stayed in Connecticut, Nell was caregiver for him. So this is a side of her people just don't know. Oh, yeah. Even when Marcia Mills, who wrote a book about her, a memoir about her, developed lupus while she was in Monroeville, Nell sat at the hospital all night with her, the first night she was there until her mother could arrive in Monroeville and help handle the psychic shock of lupus disease. Mm-hmm. The reality is that she dreamed of being a writer like her best friend, Truman Capote. She dreamed of spreading her wings and soaring. When she asked me to do the eulogy for her funeral, she said, "If I die in New York, I want to be cremated and I want my ashes spread across Manhattan." I don't know exactly how. I guess from a plane that would have satisfied her dramatic flair. But she said, "If I die in Monroeville, I want you to do the eulogy, and I don't want any other preacher there but you." And I told her, "That's because I'm not enough of a preacher to do you any harm, right?" She said, "Right."
What kind of pressure did you feel doing her eulogy?
Jeff, I've done a lot of funerals and I've done a lot of weddings. I still teach a Sunday school class with 107 people, and most of them are over 80, so I do some of the eulogies for people that I love and have taught in Sunday school. But I have never done anything in my life as difficult as doing a eulogy for Nell.
I can imagine.
What do you say? Mm-hmm. And it was wonderful in that Monroeville respected her privacy so much that no one showed up except family members. There were 40 people there. Wow. All related to her in one way, or her best friends, or her African-American caregiver. And so it was a very small group, but that didn't make it any less pressure. In fact, in some ways, that accelerated the pressure because everyone knew her.
Yeah.
And when I delivered the tribute to her, which became her eulogy, I had respected her expression, I don't want you to talk about me. You can talk about the book, but you can't talk about me. And that is something that in all my speeches about her during her lifetime, I did. I said, when people would invite me for big reads in Brooklyn, New York, or Holland, Michigan, or wherever, I would say, I'm not going to talk about her. I will talk about the book, and I will talk about the way the book's used, and I'll talk about interpretations of the book. I will talk about the titles of the book in 40 different languages, but I will not tell you about anything that is private in the life of Harper Lee. And that's what I did in the eulogy, because I felt like that last day she deserved to be treated exactly like she had been treated by me all those years. And that allowed me to get through otherwise I would have been crying like a baby. But as long as you can stay focused on the work of art, you can get through it.
Right. Now, obviously, the book is going to have more of a personal approach to it. Did you tell her that at some point you wanted to write this?
No. In fact, I had no intention of this book ever being a book. I had all these letters, but I have a granddaughter in Seattle, Washington, named Harper. And my assumption was that Harper would someday have all the letters, including some about her and her name, which is one of the 10 most common names for females in the United States. And so I thought, well, I'll give them to Harper. But what provoked me to write this book was during the last few months of her life, especially, the conspiracy theory about the publication of Go Set a Watchman, that it was a greedy lawyer who had manipulated her into signing a contract against her will, that if she'd wanted another book written, that she would have had it published before she got in this physical condition. So I decided, okay, then what I'm going to do is try to right the wrong that had been done by the national press, especially the New York Times, which was the sort of leading paper about the conspiracy, using anonymous sources, both of whom I have identified pretty clearly in my mind, who both had very serious grievances against the lawyer and against Harper Lee. So I thought, if the prevailing assumption is that Harper Lee had dementia, that she was incapable of giving informed consent to the publication of a book which did not do her literary reputation any good, and over the objection of her nephew, Hank Connor, Louise Connor's son, who urged her not to publish it and said, you didn't work on it since 1956. You certainly can't expect it to be an important book, and you have this literary legacy. Why would you endanger that literary legacy by allowing this second-rate kind of book to be published? And the answer to that is probably $100,000, because she was a child of the Depression, and the advance on the play is $100,000, and HarperCollins said, we're going to publish 2.3 million copies of this book. This will be the largest publication of an adult novel, first printing, in the history of American publishing. Only J.K. Rowling, a British writer, and with a piece of adolescent fiction, had ever had a larger press run in an American press than Go Set a Watchman. And I think the thought that America would suddenly re-engage with To Kill a Mockingbird through Go Set a Watchman is the reason she agreed to this. And during the time that this last pivotal few months of her life, we were with her constantly. And for instance, I walked in, and on the ottoman, she had the complete works of C.S. Lewis, the famous British theologian at Oxford and Cambridge. And since I was a theologian, I said, Nell, I didn't know you loved C.S. Lewis. She said, the greatest theologian of the 20th century. And I said, what's your favorite book? And she said, Mere Christianity, the greatest work of Christian apologetics since St. Augustine's Confessions. Now, this is a woman who allegedly, to the New York Times, is not mentally astute enough to give informed consent. Right. And yet, I said, what else have you read? And she said, well, Mere Christianity, Surprised by Joy, of course, all the Narnia books. And I said, what else? She said, do you want me to go through the whole corpus of C.S. Lewis works? And I said, no, that's fine now. Well, this is months before her death.
Wow.
So I decided to write that book, to let her speak beyond the grave in her own voice to people who never knew her, who desperately wanted to know her and had a right to know her. And she never asked me not to publish the letters. And she constantly said, after I'm dead, Wayne, I don't care what you say to any audience about me. I don't care. But don't publish anything and don't do anything in my lifetime, which I didn't do.
Right.
I wouldn't have done this book had it not been for the fact I wanted to correct the prevailing narrative. Yeah. William of Ockham, a medieval Catholic monk, once said, "The simplest answer is usually the correct answer."
Right.
Historians believe that, journalists don't.
I want to switch gears just a little bit because you've written quite a few books over your career, a lot about politics, religion, and the state of Alabama. Besides being from there, besides working from there, what's your fascination with Alabama?
That's a very interesting question, Jeff, because when I came to Florida State, I didn't have any particular interest in writing about Alabama. I was interested in Florida. And my dissertation was about Senator Duncan Fletcher from Jacksonville, Florida, who was actually one of the most important and powerful senators from his election in 1908 until he died in 1936. He was a major architect of New Deal policy and agricultural policy for the United States. So I wrote my dissertation on Fletcher, and I had gotten so interested in Florida politics by the time that book was published that I moved on to Sidney Katz, the most legendary and colorful governor in the state of Florida ever. Florida is such a rational state that you generally have politicians who are reasonably rational. But I would say that Sidney Katz is the Donald Trump of Florida politics. He was a Baptist preacher from Alabama who was run out of the state because of his demagoguery. And also he ran against Tom Heflin, one of the great demagogues of Alabama politics, and barely lost. So he had cut his teeth on demagogic politics and religion and anti-Catholicism, because Tom Heflin was also a religious demagogue. He comes to West Florida and gives up the church because the Baptists had run him out of 2 or 3, so he decided he's not going to preach anymore. And he sells sewing machines all through West Florida. He was from Defuniak Springs, and so he sells sewing machines. And he decides to run for governor in 1916 against the Democratic choice, and everybody knew who it was going to be, a Supreme Court justice by the name of Knott. The Republicans, of course, didn't make any difference at that time. Well, it turns out that he goes on a rip-snorting, anti-Catholic tirade across the entire state of Florida, saying that if the Democratic candidate is elected, the Catholics are going to take over the state, that they've stored arms in a cathedral in Tampa, and they're going to install the Pope in Miami.
Oh,
which is, I don't know what the Pope would have found attractive about Miami, but at any rate. So I wrote this biography of Sidney Katz. So my first 2 books were about Florida politics. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I'll spend the rest of my life doing this. And then I was reading Booker T. Washington, of all people, and Booker T. Washington, Up From Slavery, has a great line. He said, when you find yourself in a place, you need to put your bucket down where you are.
Yeah.
And I got to thinking, why am I writing about Florida? The state I come from, the state where my people come from, is Alabama.
Let me jump in because I only have about 3 minutes left. Talk about your books. Which one's your favorite?
My favorite book is Poor But Proud, and it's the story of Alabama poor whites. Yeah. And the reason it's so important to me is in my entire teaching career, I was trying to teach students that everybody has a history. Yeah. Not just people who think they have a history, not the people who call themselves planters and had slaves. Sharecroppers had just as much history as planters did. Slaves had just as much history as sharecroppers did. Women just as much as men did. And we were teaching history in America from the top down. Uh-huh. And I wanted, obviously, an influence of the 60s to teach history from the bottom up. What kind of history do ordinary people have? And Dixie's Forgotten People, which is the story of poor whites in the South, Poor But Proud, the story of poor whites in Alabama, and almost all my other work has been essentially looking at history from the bottom up and not from the top down.
Yeah, some great titles, and some Alabama's Baptist, for example, Southern Religion and Christian Diversity in the 20th Century. Fascinating title there.
I'd worked on that book literally since I went back to Alabama in 1969, and it was published last year. And what I wanted to write was a sort of magnum opus of Southern religion, and I realized I was going to die before I got all that done. But I'd been working on Christian holiness groups, Pentecostal groups, all the forgotten people from the bottom, who now are growing. I mean, that's exponential explosion in that area. Whereas the mainstream churches, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the evangelicals like the Baptists and the Church of Christ are collapsing. I mean, there are 1 million less Southern Baptists than there were 10 years ago, for instance, in the United States. It's in free fall. The mainstream denominations had long been in free fall. So my idea was to talk about, for instance, the entire eastern coast of Florida, which has the second largest concentration of Muslims in the United States. And it's an overlay almost perfectly of the Jews who came earlier. So that Florida has the second largest concentration of Jews and the second largest concentration of Muslims in America. Well, that's really fascinating for an area that doesn't like Muslims and it has a lot of anti-Semitism. And so what I'm trying to do in that book about Christian diversity is say, whatever you think Southern religion is, it's probably not.
Yeah.
Our church, our Cooperative Baptist Church in Auburn, has had wedding of 2 gay couples in our church. One of them was a deacon. One of them was chairman of the search committee for our pastor. Not many people would think about a Baptist church in a small college town in Alabama as being open. And as I tell my critics, if you read the 7th chapter of Matthew, Jesus puts it fairly obviously, judge not that ye be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged. You don't go around judging other people.
I'm going to have to leave it right there. I could have a whole another hour discussion about religion with you. What a pleasure.
Thank you, Jeff.
I wish you all the very best.
Thank you.
Dr. Wayne Flynt, his latest book is entitled Mockingbird Songs, My Friendship with Harper Lee. But I might also remind you he has quite a robust portfolio of books he's authored. I would encourage you to Google them and take a look. And of course, available at all the usual places, Amazon and that sort of thing. But the latest one, Mockingbird Songs, My Friendship with Harper Lee. Thank you, Dr. Wayne Flynt. By the way, you can see more of our conversations online at wsre.org/conversations. We are also on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take wonderful care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by Gulf Power, a Southern company, and by viewers like you. Thank you.